Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast. This is episode 237, Parenting Without Panic.
No panicking, guys. Not here on the Hole in My Heart podcast, where we talk about how the gospel is good news for everyone, every day. I am your host, Lori Krieg, and we're coming at you from the lovely and freezing WCSG radio studio, except it might be hitting 40 degrees today. So
Wow.
that's basically swimsuit weather when you're in Michigan.
Yeah.
But I have alongside me my husband and favorite licensed therapist, Matt Krieg. Matt, how you doing?
Doing all right.
Glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you.
He's wearing a t-shirt. Are you wearing shorts with that too?
Cutoffs. No, I'm not.
I'm telling you, 40 degrees. We're a whole different animal around here. And the other side of me is our friend and the most professional radio voice among us, producer Steve.
Hi, guys.
How are you, Steve?
I'm doing pretty well. I feel like I got too many layers on.
Too many.
Yeah.
We got to get the shades out and the oils. And today we are so excited to have a friend of mine and friend of the podcast back on the air with us. And she's going to be talking about a new book. Her name is Rachel Gilson, and the title of her book is Parenting Without Panic. She's going to help us parents who can panic, specifically how we can help lead our kids in an LGBTQ affirming world. How can we help lead them with gospel peaceful confidence? Steve's going to introduce her with her professional bio so you guys can really hear from her, and then we're going to invite her on officially.
Yeah. All right. Rachel Gilson serves on the leadership team of Theological Development and Culture with Cru and is the author of Born Again This Way and Parenting Without Panic in an LGBT affirming world. She is pursuing a PhD in public theology at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and lives outside of Boston with her husband and daughter.
Okay, Rachel Gilson, welcome back to the podcast.
I'm so glad to be here, sort of with you, visually.
You are here.
I'm here, yeah.
You are in spirit. Well, we want to get to know you better. How are we going to do that, Matt?
Yeah, so we have our question of the week from last time. And the question is, what generation do you technically belong to, and which should you actually belong to?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm classified as a geriatric millennial.
Amen.
I think that's what the term, an elder millennial, born in 85. I kind of think that is maybe precisely where I belong, because if I'd been born much earlier, I would have had too many domestic responsibilities given like strongly feminine gender stereotypes, and I probably would have died. But I also don't trust robots, so I'm not sure I should have been born any later when we're going to have more interfacing with robots. This might be my safest landing point.
From a geriatric millennial to another, I see you, AI, thumbs down. Don't kill me. I know it's listening right now.
Don't kill me, robot overlords.
I liked this listener response from Lori.
This is Lori, and I live in Salem, Oregon. As for which generation I'm a part of and which one I should be a part of, I'm a young boomer, born in 62, but I feel more like an older millennial. I like real books, not ebooks. I do puzzles, crosswords, word search, Sudoku in paper books, but I also like Wordle, Connections, and the other New York Times digital puzzles. I am tech savvy, but I absolutely hate AI.
There we go. Amen.
I know slang, but I prefer complete sentences. I am a writer and an editor.
Okay.
I have a very strong work ethic, but I'm not a workaholic. I love learning new things and traveling to new places, but I also love being at home.
She's just going to be all of our best friend.
Yeah.
She just
Honestly, I would hang out with Lori. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Same. I know your little boomer heart, Matt, was just like,
yeah.
word puzzles.
Yeah,
and
talking about Wordle and
Matt puts his glasses on the end of his nose every night and then does his paper Sudoku. It's very adorable.
okay, I don't do the glasses part. Usually I take my glasses off.
Maybe you do.
Steve, which listener response stood out to you?
I just appreciated Callie. She said, I proudly identify as a Gen X, even though shamefully I am a millennial. In my defense, I grew up in a small town, so all fashion trends and pop culture came like 5 years after big cities.
That
Got
makes
it.
sense. That tracks.
Big cities like the G-Raps.
G-Raps, the big city.
Yes.
Krieger.
Yeah, I really liked what Morgan had to say. She said, I'm a zillennial, or a younger millennial, born in 93. I think I fit well with this microgeneration, but my daughter, who's 11, talks about how I was born in the 1900s, quote unquote, and it makes me feel ancient. Also, most of my friends are 10 years older than me. And having just turned 40 recently, and the kids are calling me a grandpa, I'm like, that's not how that works. Hopefully that doesn't come for quite a while.
Are you turning 40 this year, Rachel?
Nice. I am turning 40 this year. I'm very excited to turn 40.
That's a whole other episode where Lori processes turning 40 next year, and I'd like to learn from you guys. How'd you get through it? All right.
My 40s were my favorite decade, just by the way, so
Nice.
I received
Honestly,
that.
yeah.
far. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Rachel, we've heard your story. I've read it in your book, which I loved, your first book, Born Again This Way. But for listeners who are new, what is your story of your encountering Jesus? And this is how we ask the question. If part of the gospel is I am more sinful and flawed in myself than I ever dared believe, yet at the very same time more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than I ever dared hope. When was that gospel first good news for you, Rachel, and how's it still?
When was it first good news for me? Because it keeps being good news for me. So I was raised like super not churched, so it wasn't good news for me as a kid because I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
And in high school, I was like, well, religion's probably for dumb people because teenage girls are arrogant. So I was like, well. And I just had a bad view of people of faith in general, and Christians in particular, because there were a lot of them around me who I found annoying. And the other thing that I realized in high school was that the way that my female peers felt about young men, I realized, oh, actually, this is how I feel about other young women. And so it was a little hard to know what to do with that because this was 2001, which feels like a billion years ago in terms of the LGBT conversation. You know what I mean? I was like, well, is this okay? And then I rummaged around in the junk drawer of my moral reasoning as a teenager and was like, yeah, it's not hurting anybody, so this is fine. And that also sort of strengthened my prejudice against Christianity because even though I'd never been mistreated by a Christian or by a church group because of my sexuality, I just kind of knew from the air, like, oh, Christians aren't about this. Like, I want to marry a woman someday, and that's not going to fly. So I got tricked into moving to New England because I got into Yale for my undergrad. And I thought, oh, I'm in this fancy, fancy place, and I'm finally in a place where I'm going to live out my sexuality, and haha, I'm so great. And then God just like sort of picked me up and turned me in the opposite direction. So going to a nice school, I realized I wasn't the smartest person in the world. In fact, I was kind of dumb compared to my classmates, and that like hurt my little feelings. It's like, oh no, my identity. And then the girl that I was dating at the time, who was obsessed with, broke up with me in this very dramatic teenage fashion. I was like, oh no, my other feelings. I was like in this ditch of like sadness. I wasn't like in that ditch. I was like, oh, I need to turn to Jesus. I was like, no, I need a hobby. But God in his kindness, I was in this lecture. They were talking about Descartes and God. And I was like, wait, what? And then I started Googling secretly because I thought, well, I don't know any of these things. And then I started talking to these two girls I knew from the marching band who were dating each other, but identified as Christians. And so I thought, well, is there something in this for me? And they tried to explain things to me. And I was like, I don't know. It doesn't seem, I don't really get it. And then in, the dead of winter, sort of like this time right now where I am in Boston, I was in the room of a friend. She had a copy of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity on a shelf. I stole it from her, and then I was reading it between classes one day, and that was the day when the gospel was first good news to me. I was reading this little book, waiting around, and I was suddenly overwhelmed with this dual reality. One, oh, God does exist, and not like a store brand, whatever Zeus type God, but the God who made everyone and everything and who is perfect. And at that same moment, I was like, oh, no, I've met me. Like, I'm a terrible person. I'm cruel and arrogant and sexually immoral and I cheat and I lie and I'm reading a stolen book. I was like, Mom, sort of like bad news. But really quickly with that, I think the Spirit caused me to understand that part of the reason Jesus had come was to place himself as a barrier between God's wrath and me. So the only way to be safe was to run towards Jesus, not away from Jesus. I was like, I don't want to become a Christian. Christians are really lame.
Yeah, dude.
But I was also like, this is a really good deal. I should take this. I should take this deal. Well, I kind of scrunched up my eyes and was like, okay, fine, I'll become a Christian. And luckily, I ran basically right into a Christian group at Yale Students for Christ. And I followed them around like a little baby quail, learning all the things you need to learn, and found a community of people who loved Jesus and each other, and they loved me. So one of God's first moves in making the good news really good to me was that community. It made all the difference in the world.
How do you still need that good news?
Constantly, all the time. So, for example, I was thinking about, our listener, someone mentioned they have an 11-year-old. I have a freshly minted 11-year-old. And one of the things I love about her is that she doesn't believe things the first time she hears them. She wants to, poke at it. She wants to turn it around. And even as she's considering the gospel, she's like, I don't know. Is it beautiful? Is it actually good? And so part of how I need the good news is realizing like, I'm not going to be able to like trick this girl into being a disciple of Jesus. Like it's going to have to be a work of the Spirit.
Yes.
And that's actually good news for me because it releases me from the pressure of having to manufacture something in her life. Like I'm allowed to just be myself and continue offering things and asking the Spirit to move. Because if it were something that I could manufacture or was responsible to manufacture, I think I would actually be crushed to death.
Yeah. Well, and that actually seems to go along with the theme of your book, which was titled Panicking.
Panicking while parenting.
Panicking while parenting. That's the second copy. Yeah. But no, it seems to go along with the premise of your book, parenting without panic in an LGBT affirming world. And like parents, we can panic so much about so many things. And I guess with this particular topic, to get into your book, like what are some of the ways that you have seen or interacted with parents who are just in the throes of panic?
Yeah, there's so many different angles from which panic can come, right? Sometimes parents are panicking over the idea of contamination, like, oh, if my children get exposed to LGBT stuff, then like it's going to infect them in some way. That the best version of that is probably taken from the scripture's view of like being holy. Like, what does it mean to be holy? And how do I do this? But most of the panic in my actual friends or in my neighborhood is just in worrying about miscommunication of different types. Like, oh, I want to teach my kids to be loving, but I don't know how to like be loving without potentially looking like I'm compromising with the world, or looking like I agree when I don't agree, or maybe like sending false messages to my children or to my neighbors. And I don't know how to like not do the culture war thing, but also do the Jesus thing. Even my friends who had really good Christian parents, right? Some of my friends didn't grow up in the church like me, whatever, but even my friends who had great discipling moms and dads, like they didn't grow up in this cultural moment. So their moms and dads didn't have to help them navigate these cultural questions. So even they feel kind of out on a limb, like, well, wait, what? No one prepped me for this. So there's the panic of even just feeling without a guide and a little bit lost. And that's nobody's fault, but it's just where I think a lot of us find ourselves right now.
You start out in the book talking about how the word no is a powerful word, but maybe not the most helpful as a place to begin, like teaching about God's design for marriage and for sexuality. Why start out with that premise of the word no?
Yeah, I'm I'm not the first Christian or person to realize that like you can't live on a diet of no. If you know, I don't know how many of your listeners like love reading the Puritans, but even Thomas Chalmers, old dead guy, was like, right, when we're trying to build a powerful life, there's the expulsive power of a new affection. Like we have to love things first if we're going to put to the side other things, lesser things maybe, or whatever it is. No is an important word. There are things in the world that are dangerous for us or hard for us, but we have to start with yes. And I think that's because God starts with yes. When Genesis opens, the first word isn't like, hey guys, watch out for all these things. It opens with a beautiful creative vision of God unfolding a world, a universe that is full of life and order and potential and goodness. And he sets the man and woman right there and says, you are going to love this, right? Like this is going to be full of bountiful blessing. So if God starts with yes and continues to give yes, then I think that's a good path for us to follow as well. So the no's end up in their correct place.
You mentioned the idea of contamination. And I think a lot of parents, some have, like that I've talked to, have put their kids in certain schooling systems, which this is not going to be a thesis statement on what's the right schooling system. See other episodes where we've talked about a lens through which we can look at that. But how do you view kids being in environments where there is this alternate gospel of love, like love is love, and it sounds so good, and it can just permeate their pores because it's like such an easy catchphrase. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would love to. I think part of the reason a phrase like love is, well, one, everyone loves, a catchphrase that really works, right? You're like, oh, that whoever came up with that was like, this one pops, right? Like love is love. It's actually dumber than you think, but when you hear it, it's great. We live in a secular culture, right? And secularism, do a little Western cultural theory, is the daughter of the gospel, right? She's the teenage daughter rebelling against her mom, being like, I don't like you, but I want to keep using your stuff, So she looks just like her mom, but she's kind of trying to disfigure her face or have a different haircut. So secularism didn't come from nowhere. You get it from centuries of the gospel permeating thinking. And so one of the things that secularism loves from the gospel and wants to keep is this concept of love, this radical acceptance, because the gospel also includes radical acceptance.
Right.
It wants to include the idea that we are all made for intimate, deep relationships. And that's from the gospel. God is the one who said we were all made for deep, intimate relationships. So many of the things that exist in secularism that are true because of what they borrow from the gospel, and the ways they go away from the gospel is because they cut Jesus out in some way. They cut God out in some way. So even as I have my daughter in a public school here in Massachusetts, and that's like progressive central, right? Like things are covered in rainbow flags, etc. Well, like I already told you, my daughter is a person who's going to say no to everything at first. And so I thought, okay, if I had a kid who was just going to believe everything she hears, maybe I'd have to make a different schooling decision. But I feel comfortable with her in this school system because she thinks critically about, sometimes over-critically about everything. And so part of what we do is we have conversations together. Like, tell me the kind of stories you're hearing, and we kind of run them against what the gospel is. Because we shouldn't assume that our neighbors only believe ridiculous things. They're made in God's image, so they're going to be attracted to the things God has made them for. It's really about discerning, since our hearts are all prone to run away from God, how are we all trying to get his stuff while avoiding him? And so I think that's, we learn to think as a missionary early, which sometimes, my daughter, she's like, oh my God, Mom, please stop. I'm like,
right.
like let's think these ways. So we are made for love. Yes. And maybe love is also deeper and richer and thicker than our culture is currently telling us it is.
Well, so, I don't know, you said your daughter is a freshly minted 11. Have some of those conversations, the stories and everything, have they been leaning more toward relationships and sexuality and everything? Like, there's so many times that parents are afraid to approach those subjects. And so, whether it's fear of doing it wrong, do it too soon, too late, whatever, like, how have you started those conversations? What is an age appropriate time to start some of those conversations in your mind?
Yeah, and I do think it's one parent I talked to long ago in terms of like, when do you start talking about issues of, reproduction, sex, sexuality? They said to me, earlier than you think, which I thought was a good, like, we try to create some rule, like you have to do it when they're this many years old or this, whatever, like it's kind of just earlier than you think. We're at a weird disadvantage in our culture because most humans just grew up around animals. And so like you knew where the new cows came from because you were observing the cows, right? Like sexuality was just around. We live in this more like sterile, disinfected world. So a lot of that is actually just hidden from us where it wouldn't be normally. So one of the things that I've found really helpful is like, okay, well, what if I just start talking to my daughter about these topics before she even knows that they need to be awkward? As in like, okay, well, she was a question asker, ask for things. I'm like, oh, okay, well, we'll just start having the conversation early. We start talking about this stuff at like 2 or 3. You know how kids listen? Like you start talking and she runs away. You start talking and she seems to listen. And then 2 days later, she asks you a follow-up question. You're like, oh my God, that's not what I meant at all. So you kind of have the conversation a lot. Like what are male and female bodies like? How do we get new life? And I figured, okay, well, if we just keep having the micro conversations along the way, and I do it in a way that is calm and confident, I'm going to be able to signal to her that she's never going to be shamed or punished for asking me questions, that she's not going to cause me to curl up into embarrassment or fear when we talk about it. I want her to experience me and her father as sources of the truth. That like we can just have these conversations. And so far that has been true. When she hears things at school that she's like, I don't know about that, she has been free to come and talk to me. Like when her kindergarten teacher is a woman who's married to another woman. And I distinctly remember a conversation because Anna and I had talked about, Anna's my daughter's name, we had talked about reproduction. She was like, oh, our teacher told us today that her wife is pregnant. I don't really know how they did that since neither of them are boys, but there must have been, I don't know, there must have been something involved there. And it like the way she talked about it wasn't like, she wasn't afraid of that. She was just like curious. Oh, based on what my mother told me about reproduction, something different must have happened here. So it was just her expressing like, oh, I recognize some categories here and what must have happened. I found that sort of encouraging. Like, oh, right. Well, let's talk about things.
How did you pivot that to the gospel? Like, how did you use that as a launch point?
Well, so there's been a lot of different times when I've interacted with my daughter or other kids at my church when they're little, when they kind of want a good, bad split the whole world. Like, oh, there's good guys and there's bad guys. And so early on, when my daughter realized, oh, we go to church and it's like a big part of our lives, but our neighbors don't, we must be good guys and they're bad guys. I was like, wrong. Nope. We are, all of us, made in God's image, and we are all born rebels.
Yeah.
So the only difference between our neighbors and us is that we live in a house where mom and dad have said yes to Jesus, and our neighbors haven't yet said yes to Jesus, but maybe they will.
So good.
It's a helpful category to make the gospel the difference. And to say like, okay, well, if I've said yes to Jesus, then I've said he is my king. So I'm going to follow his rules. But if my neighbor hasn't said yes to Jesus, she doesn't have any reason to follow Jesus's rules. She hasn't identified him as her king. Not only that, because I belong to Jesus, he's given me his spirit. If I didn't have the Holy Spirit, I wouldn't even be able to obey him. My neighbor doesn't have Jesus as her king. She doesn't have the Holy Spirit, so she's not even able to walk in radical obedience. So that day when my daughter mentioned her kindergarten teacher's wife who was pregnant, I don't remember if we had a gospel conversation, but we had many conversations about, of course, you're going to see people around you who make different decisions than we do. It's the least surprising thing in the world that non-Christians act like non-Christians. Our role is just to love.
So getting back to the just talking to your kids about sex, those conversations, you borrow from Birds and Bees, like an Instagram account that's all about those conversations.
Well, I don't know if they're on Instagram. I'm uncool with the social media. I found them on Google.
They're on both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have this framework of like having the conversation, talking about seeds and eggs. What is that all about?
Yeah, I thought this was really helpful. My friend Julie, who is raising 4 children, she was the one who pointed me in their direction because they don't specialize in LGBT questions. They're just like, how do you talk to your kids about sex, period? So I was like, oh, I would love to actually hear experts in this field talk about it. And they were like, listen, you can talk about the basics of reproduction. It doesn't have to be this sexualized thing. And you can talk about it really early using this image of seed and egg, like mammal life. To get a new cat, you need the seed and the egg of a cat. You know, egg, ovary, it's like you could use Latin terms or whatever, but kids know what an egg is, although that can be confusing because obviously it's not a poultry egg, right? You're like, hey, we've got these 2 elements that make new life. Anytime you want a new pig, you need the seed and an egg of a pig. Anytime you want a new dog, you need the seed and an egg of a dog. And the male dogs make seeds and the female dogs make eggs. You just like, there's ways that you can just start to teach your kids the categories. Here's how they go. And as you get more complex, you know, eventually you're like, well, yeah, humans too, we're mammals, right? Seed and egg. Now, eventually you're going to have to talk about like, well, how does that seed get to the egg? And Birds and the Bees is this whole like episode that's really great. They're like, listen, you need to practice a sentence you feel comfortable with. Practice before your kids ask, right? This is how the seed, oh, I'm so glad you asked. They teach you to like vamp, you know, your kid, like, how does it work? I'm so glad you asked, honey. That's a great question. While you like breathe into a bag behind your back. You get so nervous about it, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, well, the seed, the husband places his penis inside his wife's vagina and the seed travels through the penis to the egg inside his wife. And that's how the seed gets to the egg or whatever, you know, a sentence that works for you, that kind of amplifies those things. And you're like passing out, bleeding from your eyes because you're so nervous about this conversation. And your kid hears that sentence, they're like, okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Or they're like, ew. And then they run off and they don't care that much. You know? So like we can make this big old moment about it. But actually it's just biology. And that's okay. As Christians, we want to have both biology and theology in the conversation. But the biology is actually a safe place to start. We have to remember that our kids haven't had, well, some kids have actually been really horribly abused, right? But in general, these kids haven't been overly sexualized. So to them, they're not carrying all of the baggage of being sexual beings that often we have as grownups. And so we can talk on the biological level in ways that are just like, hey, this is a good way that God has created new life coming into the world, and you can know about it. You don't need like an advanced degree in biology. It's simple on some level.
It is. And thank you for making that clarification too of biology and theology. I found when I was talking to my girls about this, it helped me to panic less when I recognize I'm like, this is biology. But then when I put it in the gospel context, I was just like, oh, this preaches God's love for the world.
Yes, it does. Yes,
and then
it does.
I was like, this is not a huge deal. And if you're also preaching God's love for the world to your kids since they're babies, I found when my girls did have a little like bug eyes, like what? When I pivoted away from biology back to theology, they were like, oh, I know Jesus and he's safe. And I know my mom and she's safe. And so it did. Yeah. The gospel calms down our prefrontal cortexes. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
I loved this distinction you made. So simple, but so powerful and timely for right now, for parents. You talk about identity and you talk about how the world looks inward to get their identity, but God says it's outward. This is helpful in LGBT context. This is helpful when we hate our bodies, if we're struggling with, eating disorders. It doesn't matter. Can you speak to that distinction?
Yeah, and this relates again to secularism. Like secularism is this cut off gospel. The Christian like view of the person always includes that there's an inner person and an outer person, and they need to be aligned.
Yeah.
Like the gospel is about integrity. Jesus is like, your heart has to match your outsides.
Yeah.
Like this is just good news.
Yeah.
And so Christian tradition is like Augustine, he's like, you have to look inward in order to look upward. John Calvin talking about you need to know both yourself and God to have a complete picture. Like Christianity's always talked about this, but when secularism cuts off the gospel part of it, you can't look inward to look upward. Suddenly you're just stuck looking inward. And this ends up being a toxic gospel of discovery. Because here's the thing. Our identity is given to us by God and is something we discover. They don't have to be pitted against each other. He gives us ourselves and we discover ourselves. But if we cut out the picture of gift, we're only left with discovery. And part of the bad news of the gospel is my heart's actually busted. Like when I look inward, I'm going to find some good things and neutral things, but I'm also going to find some bad things. And if I don't have the gospel, when I encounter those bad things, I'm either going to have to pretend they're good, which doesn't last very long, or I'm going to be crushed because they really are bad. So when I'm looking for my identity, if I look inward, I am going to find things that are true about myself. But God is the one who helps me, like through forgiveness and the gift of purpose, say, hey, like I've actually made you to be a certain person. Like I've given you your particular body. I've set you in your particular time. We're talking about generations, right?
Yeah.
Like I've given you a particular personality, and you're going to continue to discover all the good works I've prepared for you in that. So the discovery aspect is vital, but it only works if it's set in the context of gift. Like God has given me to myself and given me to my neighbors. And I have to understand his character and his word if I'm going to steward that gift correctly. So the discovery aspect is an invitation to discipleship.
Can you, I guess, dive a little deeper into that, specifically with maybe the conversation about gender, because that's a place where parents are absolutely terrified. And yet you have this biological piece, and there's been culturally a kind of disintegration of biology and identity. And so can you speak into that a little bit?
Well, let's see. I'll speak and then you can tell me if I did. Yeah, that's right. I wonder, so like born in 1985, I think I was actually born in this like perfect little window to be a tomboy that I was. I looked at my body and I was like, well, this is the body of a girl, because I'd been told by my mother and other people like, well, this is what a girl's body looks like. But I never had girly interests. I remember someone giving me a Barbie as like a 7th birthday present. And I was like, well, what if I just cut off all her hair and give her tattoos? And like, what am I supposed to do with this thing? I always gravitated, I don't know, towards things that were more typically boyish. And the nice thing about having my childhood in the mid-90s in the particular household that I had was like, no one ever made me feel like that didn't make me a girl. That actually I was just a girl. I was a girl who liked these particular things. I wonder sometimes if I had been born later and I had that same female body and those same interests, if there wouldn't have been pressure to be like, well, but are you really a girl? Our bodies are a gift. Now, there are times when our bodies send mixed signals. I've got a good friend who's got 2 kids who have intersex conditions, right? So we're not saying, like, the fall has touched a lot of us. Like, sometimes our bodies do send confusing signals about who we are. For the vast majority of us, our bodies are male or female in like very clear ways. And so we can emphasize that to our kids. Like, look, you can know you're a boy. Look at your body. You've got a boy's body, and little boys are so good. It's so good that you're a boy. Well, look at your body. You have the body of a girl, and that is so good. It's so good to be a girl. And there are lots of different faithful ways to be boys and girls. We actually have so much freedom in the scriptures in terms of what it means to be male or female. It's a little like the freedom we have with church. As in, when you read the New Testament, you see some elements that have to be true of a church, right? You need to have the ministry of the word, some singing, mutual accountability. Like, you can see these elements of what makes a church. But there's actually very little other description. So you might have all of those elements in like 11th century Sweden, and all of those elements in right now, I don't know, Rwanda. And you're like, look, all of the elements are present, but like that 11th century Swedish church and that church in Rwanda today, they're not going to look very similar, but they're both faithfully representing all of those elements of the church. I think it's similar with male and female. Like, we want to represent in the world, because God created male and female very good. We want to represent to each other that we are male and female, to display that goodness that God created. But there's also a ton of freedom of what that means. You can have all kinds of interests as a boy. You can have all kinds of interests as a girl. They don't have to undercut the gift of who you are. They can just be different types of expressions. This has been really fun even in my own house. I'm not a very girly girl. My daughter kind of is. She didn't get that from her dad, and she didn't get it from me. And so it's kind of fun to be like, oh, look at you being all unexpectedly feminine. Maybe I should have expected it. I don't know. And it's nice that we can just both be in the house, both be female together, and be like, look at this. Multiple ways to be female faithfully. No one's confused about who we are. We're just figuring ourselves out together. It's really nice, actually.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah, that kind of brings us to a hopeful place. And, we've been just really enjoying this conversation, and what we've been doing lately, kind of when we get to the conclusion, is just end on a place of hope. So just thinking about a listener or a viewer who is a parent, who is maybe a caregiver or pastor, who maybe is struggling or feeling like, I don't know how to have these conversations, or I did it wrong, or, whatever. Is there something that you could say to them to just leave them with a challenge in a good way, or some hope as they, as we support this next generation during the times we find ourselves in?
I mean, who among us hasn't done it wrong, right? There's just, we're covered in grace. There's like every day is a brand new gift to receive. When I worked as a campus minister, like with college students for a long time, and the kids who grew up in Christian households who came into university and were strong in the faith, I just kept asking them, like, why did you not get inoculated to the gospel? How did this be real to you? And I tell you, the number one answer I heard over and over and over and over again was those kids saying, well, it was real for my parents, as in when they did something wrong, they asked for forgiveness. They saw that their parents were so vulnerable to the gospel in good ways, that they were able to be vulnerable to their kids. So if we get to a place where we realize, oh, wait a minute, there are better ways I could be having this conversation with the kids in my life. Well, you just say, ooh, okay. You ask for forgiveness if you've done something wrong. And maybe you haven't done something wrong. There's something to do better. You can just restart that conversation with the kids. Be like, you know what? I was listening to this thing, or I was thinking about this, and I think there's a better way to have this conversation. I'm sorry if some of the other ways that I communicated to you were less helpful. I'm just trying to figure this out too. And your kids will respect you for that. And they're like, oh, okay. Like because you're communicating again with calm confidence that you are a source, that you're a source of good information, and that you will continue to grow in your ability to be a source of good information. Because you don't want to communicate to your kids like, well, you just have to have it all figured out. We want to communicate. We're always figuring it out, and there's safety and provision to do so. God wants to help us be the best version parents, caregivers that we can. So he's going to continue to help us, right? We have every reason to be encouraged.
I love that.
Yes. Thank you, Rachel. You've really offered us some peaceful parenting, caregiving, pastoring of the next generation, just in your own posture and in the teaching that you gave us today. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. I hope, I don't know, we can do this without fear, right?
Yes.
Like God can help us.
That's so true. And I just want to say to you too, just as an encouragement, just as you were talking, I was just like, man, thank you, God, for making Rachel Gilson and having her find you so that you can be speaking into this space. This conversation led me personally to worship for just God making you. So, and having you speak into this space for such a time as this. So thank you, Rachel.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the encouragement.
Of course. I really was encouraged by Rachel this time, as well as the other times we've had her. If you guys check out the show notes, you're going to see links to at least one other time that we have talked with Rachel about her first book, Born Again This Way, and this time about her parenting journey. We're also going to link to her site. She's not on the socials, as well as that Hold My Heart podcast Facebook group, where we have our question of the week, which is a real dumb one. It's real dumb. What is the best way to eat potatoes? Why, Lori? Why? I don't know. I probably looked at our freezer and there was frozen potatoes from Meijer, Aldi. And I was like, hey, potatoes. Our son, our 5-year-old, likes to eat them frozen French fries. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Also raw oats, not oatmeal.
Huh.
It says they're very gross. Steve, how do you eat potatoes?
All I can think is I'm trying to recall the line from Lord of the Rings.
Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Yeah. Taters?
No taters?
Taters? I don't know. Probably, I really do like mashed potatoes with gravy.
Okay, with chunks in them or nah?
I'm okay if there's a little bit of chunkiness. I'm all right with that. I think probably I'd take the creamy, non-chunk version, but I'm okay either way.
This is the best conversation I've ever had. Matt, look at me. I'm like, and also you, Matt, what's your opinion about this matter?
I mean, any type of potato is a good potato in my book, as long as it's not green and poisonous. Because aren't they members of the nightshade family? Like if you don't bury them again when they're growing, they turn green and they become poisonous.
Sure.
You taught me this literally last week when you were teaching our kids. So yes, Matt,
So
according to you.
I don't know. I just, as long as they're not those poisonous green potatoes, we're good.
There's no way of knowing this answer.
I could Google it, but I don't want to.
Google.
No.
We like to just think, use our brains.
We could ask AI. Like, yes, the green potatoes are fine.
We're going to be cooking for it after this episode. All right, guys, if you want to answer this wonderfully deep question, you could go to the Hold My Heart podcast Facebook group. Just search it, answer a couple questions. I'll let you in the door and give you a welcome. If you like this podcast, take a minute to rate and review. But I forgot one more important thing, because this actually is important, is I do want to hear from Matt and Steve about, what did you think about Rachel? What was one standout thing? Matt, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I really liked how she talked about kind of that historical identity development piece, the inward and the outward, the like knowing yourself knowing God
Yeah.
as like crucial to forming a Christian identity, because so often in our culture it is just that follow your heart, look in your own self, and it's just not good enough.
No, it's not. It's not going to last. Steve?
I had so many things in my head. Then we started talking about potatoes.
I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding.
I
I'm
jumped
just
to
kidding.
taters.
I also was really struck by, like you were saying, Matt, the historical view of kind of what's happened in culture. I've always thought of secularism as just like, well, you have two options in life. There's religion / God, and there's secular. But that picture of secularism being the teenage daughter of the gospel, that it's just like, well, I don't want anything to do with you, but I want to keep this good stuff that you've given me. That was just, I don't know, that just has really got my wheels turning.
I thought the same thing. I was like, dang, Rachel, you're so good at taking really complex historical reality of our faith and making it simple, like with the teenage daughter. Because I was like, yes, there's this longing in the heart of Imago Dei humans for God. We just don't want the sacrifice that comes with it. We maybe will admire someone else's sacrifice, but when at the end of the day, we want the gifts, not the giver. But we flourish best when we look through the gifts to the giver. And anyway, that was my favorite part, was the secularism and how it's cutting the gospel off at the knees, but it's not enough. If you guys love Rachel too, go get her book. It's awesome. Parenting Without Panic in an LGBT Affirming World. You can also go to her site. Just want to thank WCSG before we click off here. Thank you to the Zach of all trades, the hunter intern in the woods. Does he have the internet in the woods? I don't know, but somehow he helps us get these videos done. Thank you, Hunter. And thank you, the listener, for joining us today. For all of us here at the Hole in My Heart podcast, we will see you next time.